Welcome everybody to the USAID Climate MEL Learning Series. Today we're going to be talking to you about EG.13 Sustainable Landscapes reporting. I'm Larissa Warhol. I'm part of the REFS Bureau in the Center for Natural Environment in the Natural Climate Solutions Division. I'm one of the MEL leads for our team, and I'm here with Patrick McGuire, who's our other MEL lead. You want to say hi, Patrick?
Hi, everyone.
And today we're going to be talking to you about EG.13 reporting, but first we're going to introduce the natural climate solutions and our climate strategy and why this is important to the strategy. We're going to look specifically at some of the standard F indicators, some illustrative examples. We're going to talk specifically about carbon markets because it's really relevant to our sustainable landscapes reporting. And then finally, some indirect reporting at the end. So I will turn it over to Patrick to get us started, and then I will be back with you midway through.
Thanks, Larissa. Okay, well, first, we want to set the stage here talking about what are we referring to with climate mitigation in particular for those of you who are relatively new to this space, put it within the context of natural climate solutions, and then we'll talk a little bit more about how that all fits in within the climate strategy. So climate change mitigation, the space that we're working in here is talking about reducing the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And there's essentially two ways to do that. You can reduce the production and release of greenhouse gases, multiple ways to do that, including reducing the use of fossil fuels, addressing deforestation and fertilizer use in livestock. Then there's a second way, and that's actually pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, and that's referred to as carbon sinks or sequestering carbon. So there's things you can do. There's technological solutions, direct air capture, and then there's using the natural environment. So how oceans, forests, and soil can pull carbon out of the atmosphere. And just one thing to flag is USAID's definition of mitigation involves human intervention. So anthropogenic sources of reducing emissions or enhancing these sinks of greenhouse gases. Okay, so this next slide, we're going to talk a little bit more about getting more specific on the natural climate solutions aspect of mitigation. So the role that forests and landscapes play are critical to solving the climate crisis. And the graphic here is showing that essentially natural climate solutions account for 20 to 25% of global emissions. This is from a study that came out of TNC in 2017 called Natural Climate Solutions. It gives the big picture on the potential on a global scale for these sustainable landscape, otherwise known as natural climate solutions. There are three basic pathways that we're talking about here in terms of conserving, restoring, and sustainably managing forests and lands to reduce emissions and support local economies. Again, the landscapes we're talking about here, a lot of this is focused on forests, but there's other critical high carbon density landscapes that we work in, including mangroves and peatlands or wetlands, but also managed landscapes such as agricultural landscapes and things like plantations would fit under management. And just to drill down a little bit more, when we talk about conserving and restoring and managing for that matter, there are co-benefits associated with natural climate solutions. So for example, with conserving, we can address biodiversity issues. It's going to also capture water and soil resources and positive benefits for those resources. It's going to increase resilience to extreme weather. We're going to reduce risk from floods and drought. So there's these co-benefits that ride along with natural climate solutions. It's not just about the climate mitigation. We talked about a quarter of the solution is coming from natural climate solutions. So essentially, we can't get to this 1.5 degree target by 2050 without addressing natural climate solutions. We've stalled long enough on addressing climate change that our back's against the wall, and all solutions are necessary to solve this. And certainly with sustainable landscapes being 20 to 25% of it, we need to address it. The other important point to flag here is that 20 to 25% globally, right? But the countries that USAID are working in, it's even a bigger percentage in lower income countries where these emission solutions can be found in terms of forest and landscapes. And this is just focusing in on the the three pathways that we already talked about. So conserve, preventing the loss of native ecosystems. Management is improving production systems like farms and ranches and working forests, plantation forests, and restoring, bringing native ecosystems back to areas where they were lost. So things like reforestation and re-wetting wetlands. And the first one and the third one are really, it's important to note, are focused on natural ecosystems, native ecosystems. I'll also say that it's not just site-based work that we're talking about here. It's the things that sort of enable these solutions as well. So governance issues, financing issues, they could all count for SL programming in terms of mitigating greenhouse gases from natural climate solutions. And the funding in the past, in the recent past, has typically focused about 2/3 on the conserving aspect of this, with about 20% of our funds going towards management activities and 15% for reforestation. It's partly because the management activities are a little bit more dispersed in terms of the amount of greenhouse gas mitigation you can get per hectare. Restoration work tends to be more expensive than conservation work. It's cheaper to keep a forest standing than to try and regrow a forest. All right, so the next slide. We were hearing from missions for more clarity on what counts towards sustainable landscape programming. So working with the missions, we identified 4 criteria that would help missions just know if they're working in the right space and doing it correctly. These are minimum criteria that are intended to provide clear guidance on this and just make sure that the SL funding aligns with the standardized program structure definition, the SPSDs. So the 4 here are: have an explicit impact on climate change mitigation, objective to reduce, avoid, and or sequester land-based greenhouse gas emissions. So you have to have the intention of achieving these goals. For the direct funding we're talking about here, direct SL funding, be based on analysis and evidence. So this is sort of consistent with the overall program cycle at USAID, focusing on the highest potential for mitigation. So seek to achieve mitigation impacts at scale. And numbers 2 and 3 kind of go together, right? So you're looking for the evidence, and the evidence should be driving you towards where you're achieving the greatest results at scale. Things like sustainable landscape opportunity assessments are particularly helpful with this. It's something that our group, the Natural Climate Solutions Division, can help missions with. So reach out to us if you have questions about developing one of these SLOAs if you haven't already. And those are looking at like what's the biophysical potential in any particular country for greenhouse gas mitigation from natural climate solutions. Also particularly effective if you combine those with political economic analyses. And the last one here: monitor, report, and manage adaptively. So tracking progress and reporting on the standard and custom indicators. That's what we're talking about today. And learning and adapting as per the overall guidance of the program cycle. This next slide is just looking at how this all fits within the climate strategy for USAID. So this strategy came out in 2022. And it takes a whole of agency approach to climate change. So we're all activities are meant to help contribute to be thinking about, the impacts and the potential solutions to the climate change challenge. And I guess central here is this concept of it's ambitious, enabling ambitious approaches to natural climate solutions. So looking at things like building capacity in country is particularly important, targeting highest priority communities and locations to maximize our impact. And yeah, again, this keyword of ambitious. We'll talk about the targets that were set up under the solution in a moment, but also equitable mitigation. So how is this advancing the just transition that is required and that we're working towards as a development agency? Here are these top line climate targets under the climate strategy. And this is what we hope to achieve in this, 9-year span, 2022 through 2030. They are 6, again, ambitious, high-level targets that reflect this whole of agency approach. The reason why we're focusing on this today is to make sure that we have got accurate reporting And I'm just going to focus briefly on the three targets that are outlined in red because those are of particular relevance to natural climate solutions. So this first one, top here, mitigation of tons reduced. Our target is 6 billion metric tons reduced or sequestered through USAID activities. Of that 6 billion, 5 billion has to come from natural climate solutions. So that's why the reporting around this is so critical to ensure that we're capturing all the good work that's being done and all these tons sequestered or reduced. And then well, let me jump down to the bottom. The one that's outlined in the heavier red is land use. So hectares under improved management as it relates to sustainable landscapes, 100 million hectares. That's all coming from natural climate solutions. So again, it's why it's so critical to capture this. There was a separate presentation that Larissa did and our GR Center did on this is indicator 13.8 that delves into this a little bit more. So you can, if you haven't seen it yet, you can look for the recording of that. And the finance. So public and private finance mobilized. We're aiming to achieve $150 billion. And natural climate solutions is not the lion's share of this for sure. That's clean energy, but we contribute to it. On to the next slide. These are the EG.13 Sustainable Landscape indicators, the standard indicators under the SPSD. We're going to focus for our purposes here today on the ones that are highlighted in blue. So those are 13.4, 13.6, and 13.8. But just overall, just to sort of set the table before Larissa drills down on some of these, 13.1 through 13.3 are the output indicators. And many of those kind of are similar across some of the other climate program areas of adaptation and clean energy. So things like people trained and laws proposed, you'll see those lining up in some of the other pillar climate activities. Indicators 13.4 through 13.8 are the outcome indicators. And then again, 13.4, 13.6, and 13.8, these are considered the priority climate indicators for sustainable landscapes. And they align with some of the key climate strategy targets that we talked about on the previous slide. And a fundamental concept I just want to highlight here is that the SL indicators are required as applicable. And that means essentially there's two parts of it. If an activity achieves a result that can be reported towards a standard indicator, then you are required to report on it. So it doesn't mean that an activity has to achieve a particular indicator at any given year, every year. But if you do achieve a result, then it has to be reported. It's required to be reported. The other piece of this is that EG.13 climate indicators are reporting on them is required regardless of the type of funding an activity receives. So we're not just talking about direct funding here. If you have indirect funding, for example, if a biodiversity program or an agricultural program achieves any of these 13 indicators, you're also required to report on it. So that's this required as applicable concept. I should have said this earlier, but I think I've been using this term sustainable landscapes and natural climate solutions. Those are synonymous and you should think of them as such. So we kind of use them interchangeably.
On Patrick's last point, sustainable landscapes is actually the congressional directive. And so that's why we call like EG.13 is our sustainable landscapes congressional directive, but our division engages in what we consider natural climate solutions. So we just like the NCS term because it's a little bit more broad than sustainable landscapes. And just to also reiterate what Patrick said, I will be highlighting, some of these priority indicators, in particular 13.6. I will touch a little bit on 13.4, and Patrick will talk about that a little bit when we come back to carbon markets, but there is an entire separate MEL learning series presentation on the climate finance indicators. So we definitely refer you to that. We're not really looking at EG.13.8 today because there's also another separate presentation on EG.13.8 and shapefiles that we encourage you to look at. And then again, one of our, and we will probably mention this several times, but one of our brand new resources is an extended indicator handbook, which is available on Climate Links. And so again, we can encourage you to look at that. And that also provides you with a lot more details around any of these indicators, as well as just general reporting on climate indicators. So this is some of our FAQs we hear often, and Patrick really actually just really talked about this first one already in terms of who should be reporting on EG.13 indicators. And again, as he was saying, it doesn't really matter if you have sustainable landscapes funding or not. If your activity is generating a result that's applicable to those indicators, you should be reporting on it. A lot of times, given that some of our indicators are about calculating greenhouse gas emission reductions, given that, especially if it's an activity that's not the one of the direct outcomes, people often say, well, how am I supposed to report on that? We don't have any expertise in that. USAID does have an absolute calculator that you can, if you have a couple data points, you can usually fairly easily pull up a GHG emission reduction estimate. Currently, it has 7 sustainable landscapes activities. We are in the process of updating the calculator, and so which will launch at the beginning of 2025, and it will expand to an additional 4. It will be a total of 11, so an additional 4 sustainable landscapes activities. And there's also other online resources. There's a lot of tools that are actually specific to one particular landscape. So again, if there's an area you're working in, look for a tool, reach out to us. We're always happy to help. And we're also happy to give advice around what are good relevant indicators for your activity to be reporting on. And we'll get into this a little bit too, but a lot of times people are talking to, and a lot of the work that USAID does is around capacity building or enabling environment policy work. And we often get the question, should I still be reporting on the greenhouse gas emission reduction indicators and hectares? And our answer to that is yes. And as Patrick was saying, like, even you don't necessarily have to report on these indicators every single year. But at the end of the day, especially if you're receiving sustainable landscapes funding, there is that expectation that your activity in some way will lead to some sort of land-based greenhouse gas emission reductions. So even if it's in year 5 of your activity, to be thinking about how you could be reporting on EG.13 or EG.13 if it's greenhouse gas emission reductions that are going to occur in the future. So again, we're always happy to talk with people about this and provide advice, but think about, even if you're doing capacity building or enabling environment, the expectation is that work will be leading to greenhouse gas emission reductions, land-based. And so at some point, consider reporting on 13.7 and 13.8. And both of those indicators allow for the emission reductions to be happening in the future. So again, they're not things that have to be happening within the actual year of the activities. And again, we can work with you on how to calculate that. So this is just some of the things I want to reiterate about the policies and regulations. This is EG.13.3. And so if you are reporting on EG.13.3, and again, this can be, when we think about these things, are pretty broad. Laws, policies, it could be like a forest management plan, strategies, regulations, again, to be addressing sustainable landscapes or low emission development. It can be looking at NDCs, at, RED Plus activities. This is a fairly broad category, but again, at the end of the day, all these, capacity building or enabling environment activities should be contributing in some way to greenhouse gas emission reductions. So we just want to, again, reiterate that you should be thinking about how to report not just on 13.3.3, but also on 13.6.3.6 or 13.7 or 13.8. Again, when we talk about like when to report on these, we use the terms like formally proposed, adopted, or implemented during that particular reporting year. And so it might be that you're doing some work for a couple years and then it actually gets adopted or implemented. So this is not necessarily an indicator you have to report on every year. It's when it actually is applicable to the definition of the indicator. And then finally, this is also under development that we will be announcing in the beginning of 2025, but we are also working on a methodology to help you think about and understand how you can be reporting on greenhouse gas emission reductions from policy, because we do recognize that there often is a question around, okay, well, it's a policy. How do we then think about how we can be reporting on GHG emission reductions, especially given that those might be occurring after the close of the activity? So we've done a lot of stakeholder engagement, and we are working on a methodology for you all. Again, for 13.4, not going to spend a lot of time on this today, but just want to reference it is one of our priority indicators. One of the things we want to highlight is that when you are reporting on this indicator, it is not USG money. It has to be some other money mobilized, finance mobilized. It can be, another bilateral. It can be other private sector money. It can be public sector money. It's really pretty broad. All that you just have to be thinking about is that it cannot be USG money. And we, in some way, we encourage you to all take a contribution approach. You'll hear this a lot across a lot of our different indicators, but contribution versus attribution, when you take a contribution approach, we're recognizing that we're not the only player in the space, right? So USAID's influence might just be one of many factors that contributed to what you're reporting on, and that's fine. Like if you take an attribution approach, it's really saying that our intervention was the only reason why something changed. And really, quite frankly, that's rarely the case. So we're really encouraging everyone to take a contribution approach. And again, if there's questions about what counts and what doesn't, always happy to answer questions if you reach out to us. Again, if you're going to be reporting on 13.4, you should be reporting on EG.13, 6, 7, or 8, because whatever finance mobilized should be supporting some land-based GHG emission reduction activity. And when we think about, what does finance mobilized mean? It should be things that are reaching financial closure during the reporting period. When we say financial closure, we can be using any of these different verbs. But again, there's an entire MEL Climate Learning Series presentation about this topic. It's not necessarily specific to sustainable landscapes. It's across all the climate pillars, but I encourage you to go take a look at that. That will provide more details as well as our extended indicator handbook. EG.13 6 is one of our biggest priority indicators because it is one of the main ways that we are tracking how we're achieving our climate strategy 6 billion greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. So again, these are greenhouse gas emission reductions that have already occurred and will be reported during the reporting period. You can also be reporting on GHG emission reductions from closed activities where we know some of those emission reductions are still occurring. And, the easy example of that usually is like a carbon offsets project where, those GHG emission reductions are still regularly being verified by third parties. But for the most part, really, most of the people report on the GHG emission reductions that are occurring in that particular year during the reporting period. Again, we're encouraging people to take a contribution approach. And as I talked about in the FAQs, we have the AFLU calculator, but there's also a lot of other, tools out there. And Patrick will talk about this further as well. But, in terms of reporting from carbon offsets projects, you need to be using their specific methodologies that most of their standards have. So the AFLU calculator can help you with USAID reporting, but not necessarily carbon market reporting, but we'll get into detail a little bit. So I'm just going to walk you through a couple scenarios just to see in terms of what we've seen in reporting and where there are some pitfalls, and then for you all to be thinking about as well if you're engaged in certain activities that this might apply to. As Patrick said, a lot of our programming does forest conservation, and one of the biggest things we want to emphasize here is that you really need to have a baseline when you're trying to assess the impact of your forest conservation activity. That means looking at if you're working in a specific protected area, maybe the deforestation rate was 7% before your intervention started, and then as your intervention progresses, the deforestation rate goes down to 4%. And so what you're basically reporting on is the greenhouse gas emission reduction that's occurring from that decrease, that 3% decrease in the deforestation rate. And again, how can you calculate a baseline? There's a lot of really cool online platforms, things like Global Forest Watch. Again, there's a way to do projections and estimates in the AFLU calculator. There can be, depending on the context, some really good national or subnational data, but that's not necessarily universal. We have seen some missions hire, activities hire third-party greenhouse gas accounting experts as a consultant. And again, there's other carbon market methodologies that can help you give you some scientific calculations. What we typically see here is that either people often don't do a baseline. And so then when they're reporting what the entire protected area in terms of greenhouse gas emission reduction is, sequestering for the year. And so sometimes we've seen some really big numbers that when we've actually, gone back to ask, we've realized that people have not done a baseline. And so just again, want to reiterate the baseline scenario there. And then the other thing that's just a little tricky, and this is again more relevant to maybe a Red Plus project, is that you really want to make sure that even though your intervention might be lowering deforestation in the area you're working in, is that it's not actually causing deforestation somewhere else. So making sure that that is universal deforestation in that particular area versus maybe lowering it in the area you're working in, but then increasing it in some other area. And that one can be, more challenging. And again, happy to talk with people about those scenarios. Restoration, again, you do not need a baseline because we make the assumption that you're either working in some sort of degraded or deforested area. And so you're just assuming that your baseline is 0. And restoration, again, can potentially sequester large amounts of GHGs. This can be both forest conservation, but also restoration, but also things like mangrove restoration. Mangroves actually per hectare reduce quite a bit more greenhouse gas emission reductions than other landscapes. But one of the ways you think about, how are you then calculating, you can be tracking the survival rate and growth of the planted trees and estimating the greenhouse gas emissions sequestered. There's some great formulas online you can use for that. AFLU calculator, again, there's some research literature that also provides estimates on specific tree species for GHG emission reductions. And then again, you can potentially have a third-party GHG accounting expert. In terms of land, for me, like both that restoration activity as well as this initial land management scenario are fairly similar. In terms of this land management, we often are thinking about in terms of like agricultural or pastoralist lands, or maybe you're creating models of sustainable timber production. There's 2 different ways we can think about this. On the one hand, you can only count the GHG emission reductions that are occurring from carbon sequestered through things like planted trees. And again, this is super similar to restoration. You don't need a baseline. You're really just tracking the survival rate of the planted trees and using the same methods. It's just really just, again, looking at those planted trees, very similar to restoration. It's not thinking about things like soil carbon or other, practices on the farm that could be reducing greenhouse gas emission reductions. That is our scenario 2. If you are engaged in, a very robust climate smart agricultural program, including agroforestry, you can do a more robust calculation, but you would then need a baseline. And so that's because you need to have something to compare your intervention against. And so that can be doing an analysis of the whole farming system, where you could actually potentially see that maybe your farming system is actually emitting greenhouse gas emissions. And by engaging in these climate smart ag practices, you're creating a carbon sink on the farm. And so this scenario, you actually have the potential to be reporting more than you would in scenario 1, but it is a lot more complicated. You need a lot more data points for accuracy. So again, there's some various tools. Something like the Cool Farm tool, actually, you need a lot of data points for it, but it will help you do this analysis. AFLU calculator exists for various commodities, but again, it's not as robust as some others. And so this is another way to think about that. But again, we do know that there's a lot of ag activities that are doing a lot of climate smart ag or agroforestry. And so we're always happy to talk with people about whether it makes sense to be trying to report on our EG.13 indicators. I'm going to turn back to Patrick now to talk a little bit more about, EG.13.6, our AFLU calculator, and carbon markets.
Yeah, thanks, Larissa. We wanted to just focus a little bit more on carbon markets, and in particular, this one aspect of the use of the AFLU calculator. In general, carbon markets are fairly similar to other activities that USAID is working in terms of sustainable landscapes reporting, with this the primary exception. So the AFLU calculator, as Larissa mentioned, is under review and a new version coming out next year. But either version, you're not really meant to use it for carbon markets, SL reporting. And that's because it provides an estimate of greenhouse gas emissions reduced over these 8 different NCS activities. And it's it's based on IPCC methodologies, but the bottom line is that you'll just get a more accurate measurement of greenhouse gas mitigation by using the tools and methodologies that have been established within the carbon market sector. Some of these methodologies and tools have been around for years, some of them for over a decade, and they've a lot of work has gone into them from professionals that have developed these approaches. They've still received criticism from outside, and not necessarily unjust criticism in terms of overestimating baselines, for example, within the red space. But they're the best possible estimates we have at this point for the tons that these projects are sequestering or reducing. Please use those estimates. A lot of work has gone into it. There's external auditors that are on the ground, boots on the ground, so that they have their methodologies, they have the auditing process. So that's where you should be going to the registries under the various methodologies for implementing these carbon projects to determine how many tons have actually been verified or issued at this point. And then we just wanted to go over two quick scenarios within carbon market activities, again, because there's increasing interest from emissions to be working in carbon market space. But for the most part, a lot of these are the same concepts for other SL activities. So this first one is looking at USAID supporting the development of a national or subnational carbon markets, such as an emission trading system or a carbon tax or crediting mechanisms. Same concept, reporting annually for the life of the market or the tax. For new markets or tax systems, reporting can begin when the system is generating results. And again, it's taking this contribution approach Larissa spoke about. So what is USAID's influence in one of many particular factors? We don't have to be delivering everything by ourselves under the contribution approach. We're just one element of a project success. That applies here as well, the contribution approach, and reporting only on land-based credits. So clean energy results are being reported under EG.11 indicators. And the indicators that we're talking about here, theoretically, they could all apply, all of the EG.13 indicators. Some will be less likely to be achieving them under this scenario of working on a national or subnational market. So the ones that are missing here, are, I guess, more easier to describe. So the EG.13 one, the number of people trained is probably not as likely under this national carbon market scenario, but a lot of the other ones, including certainly institutions with improved capacity to address sustainable landscapes, that's 13.2. 13.3, certainly a number of laws and policies and regulations that are formally proposed, adopted, or implemented, that would apply. Investment mobilized, 13.4, 13.6, the tons, the greenhouse gas emissions, estimated metric tons, again, taking them from the registries, and the number of hectares under 13.8 or potentially under 13.7 would apply here as well. Final slide here from me is just looking at a second scenario where if it's an actual activity, USAID supporting the development of a land-based carbon offset activity. So for example, a REDD+ activity or an agroforestry activity. All of these indicators apply potentially, right? It doesn't mean you need to achieve them every year, but if you are achieving them, you're expected to report on them, 13.1 through 13.8. And these activities don't need to be actually putting a tree in the ground. It could be the capacity building around that, establishing the baselines that Larissa talked about that are essential for this work, and conducting feasibility studies. And the results that occur during the lifetime of the activity should report applicable during the reporting period. So if you're achieving a result that year, report on it that year. If it's activities like 13.7 or 13.8 that you could be achieving in the future, then you can report on the tons under 13.7, projecting forward up to 15 years, and 13.8 you can project forward as well.
Thanks so much, Patrick. We're just going to end with just two different scenarios on some indirect reporting. As Patrick mentioned at the beginning, technically you should be reporting even if you do not receive Sustainable Landscapes funding. And so, the policy is if it's applicable, you should be reporting. We do recognize that there can be some reporting burden. And so we are happy to talk to people about, both scale and burden and whether it makes sense. And again, there's actually a section in the extended indicator handbook that speaks directly to this. So I encourage you to review that in terms of thinking about, if you need to report versus like if your activity is small enough that the level of burden would be too high. But where we really typically see a lot of overlap is in our biodiversity programming, and then obviously in our agricultural programming. So I'm just going to just give two quick examples from this. A lot of biodiversity programming. We do actually often have a lot of co-funded programming with SL, but there are some standalone biodiversity programs that are very much involved in forest conservation, and so they might be conserving 10,000 hectares. And there is an already a biodiversity indicator, EG.13, which is hectares under improved management, that people often report to. You basically can review if it's applicable and meets the definitions of EG.13.8. You can be reporting on EG.13.8. It is not. We say you can double count. We don't really actually consider it double counting. It's two different funding streams, and these are if it's applicable to hectares that are going to reduce greenhouse gas emission reductions, and then it can also be applicable as hectares under improved management. So from our side, it's that these hectares are actually having two different outcomes. And the big thing that we want to share is that you can be using the same DQA, and so if you're already doing it for EG.10.2, we very much encourage people to report on EG.13.8, especially if it is applicable. There might be instances where you're working in a landscape, and EG.10.2 has, and it's disaggregates the different landscapes. And so maybe it's not all 10,000 hectares, but even if only 6,000 apply, we very much encourage people to be reporting on EG.13.8. And then finally, again, as we've talked about with agricultural activities, you might be doing a climate smart ag program. And so you do have, while the activity itself might be focusing on increasing farm productivity, one of the co-benefits might be that there is some GHG emission reductions achieved. Again, there's so many different tools you can be using, but this can be tricky because, again, it sort of depends on the size of the activity. So maybe you're not working with that many farmers, and the level of burden it would be to report on the greenhouse gas emissions is really just not worth the effort. I talk to a lot of people about, whether their ag activity should be making the effort to report on both EG.13.8 and EG.13.6. And sometimes the decision is made that there's just too much burden for EG.13.6. But even in that case, you can still be reporting on EG.13.8. There is actually also an ag hectares indicator. So it can be data that you're already collecting for the activity anyway. And so very easy to transfer that data over to EG.13.8. But we are always happy to talk to people about this. And as I said, this is probably one of the most common scenarios that people reach out to us about in terms of how they should be reporting or if they should be reporting. And so please reach out if you have any questions about that as well. So finally, this is pretty much it for us today, but we did want to share some different resources. Some of these are just some basic resources about natural climate solutions and our division. We do have specific links to both the Global Climate Change Standard Indicators as well as the Extended Indicator Handbook that we've referenced several times throughout. And as we've also mentioned throughout, this is both mine and Patrick's contact information. So please reach out if you have any specific questions about this presentation or any questions about sustainable landscapes reporting. And we thank you very much for joining us today.